Hello everyone. Welcome to the online talk series Behind the Scenes, Empirical Approaches to Platform Governance. My name is Christian Katzenbach. I'm a professor at ZeMKI at the University of Bremen, and I'm co-hosting this together with Paloma Viejo Otero, also of the University of Bremen, and Joao Megalés of the University of Groningen. I'm very happy that we are holding this final session of this year with Diyi from the University of Oxford as our 14th installment of this series. So thanks and welcome, Diyi, for joining us today. So just to get us kind of very shortly started, a few words on the online talk series for those who haven't attended sessions before. So 1.5 years ago, we started this series in order to provide a space for the community to talk about their empirical work on platform governance in a space where empirical work is often challenging. Data access is hard to get. People from the platforms, for example, might not be willing to talk to us in interviews. APIs are being closed down. And so with this series, we wanted to talk about actually these challenges and kind of put them on the table and have interesting exchanges about how to do our work in this challenging context. And we're now with the 14th talk in this series. And I'm really looking forward to your talk today, Diyi. And with that, I hand over to Paloma.
So, hello everyone. I'm very pleased to be the one of introducing Diyi today. So Diyi is coming with a talk called The Legitimacy of Platformed Speech Governance, a mixed method case study approach. I'm really excited about this. And then Diyi is a doctor in philosophy candidate in information communication and the social science at the Oxford Internet Institute. Diyi's doctoral research examines algorithm content moderation and the legitimacy of platform speech governance in South and Southeast Asian context. So the floor is yours. We are looking forward. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Paloma. Thank you, Christian, for the kind introduction. I'm just very quickly drop a link because we're just mentioning how hard it is increasingly to get data access to studying platform and data governance. And then there have been a recent call for evidence and feedback from the DSA, the delegated regulations under Article 40 of the DSA. And then some of our colleagues and also my co-authors, we co-authored the feedback form and then later turned this into a shorter blog piece. And I just share the link in the chat because it's like rather relevant to the broader discussion of accessing data to the platforms. But we also mentioned like a key theme that I'm going to address, and that is the vetting process set in the DSA regime and the potential impacts on fair representation for researchers and also similar jurisdictions out of the EU context. And that's pretty much where I'm coming from. So with that, I'll start sharing my slides. Okay. Thank you again for the kind introduction. And my name is Diyi. As Paloma just mentioned, I am a final year PhD candidate at the Oxford Internet Institute. So a bit of the context of the talk series. I myself have been here for many of the previous talks and very much inspired and encouraged by the sharings. And I presented my paper at the AIR conference earlier this year, and then later was invited to the talk, and I realized it's better. It's not really to showcase the results of the papers, but rather to talk about the nitty gritty of what have I done, what could I have done better. So this is more of a reflection of what I have been through during the past 3 years, and to reflect together on what we could have achieved from this. So the title of the talk today is The Legitimacy of Platformized Speech Governance. And I'm doing so by contextualizing what I mean by mixed methods case study approach. So of course, to start with, the terms that pretty much everyone here are familiar with, but still to set the scope of the study. So by platformized speech governance, I first mean the governance by platforms, and that is the content moderation mechanism most user-to-user internet services are running themselves. Bear with me if you have seen this diagram for many times. I really like it, so I used it for all the talks I gave during the past few years. Essentially, I use content moderation in my thesis, where the line of research refers to the governance or the self-governance mechanisms that platforms themselves use. It could range from remove to reduce and restrict, and then to recommend certain content on their platforms. So of course, it's necessary to acknowledge that UGC platforms with different scales, business models, and architecture, they tend to adopt different moderation models and visibility regimes, if you like. But for this talk, for my research, I specifically focus on industrial-sized commercial content moderation, and that is the how online platforms screen user generated content in a rather coordinated driven by policies and technical designs. So beyond governance by platforms, we also have governance through platforms, and that is looking at platforms as a infrastructure of content and speech, and to understand the moderation of online speech in a given social context that are facilitated by UGC platforms, but the pressures and the requests are coming from many other political actors in this governance network. Here we have civil society organizations, public sector, we have the public, that is the users, and also sometimes you would call them the counter-public, so different groups of social media users. So the term underscores the landscape of online speech governance that involves a network of actors in shaping the communicative process. And also it shows that I'm focusing on the platformization of online speech, and that is what we call the digital public sphere, and that's setting itself apart from the discussion of other scales of platforms such as e-commerce or online gaming that is slightly away from what I'm discussing today. So there are a lot of governance proposals and rules currently at hand. We have rights-based and principle-based guidelines and treaties by intergovernmental bodies. I myself have been engaging in some discussions related to the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms by UNESCO, but you also have platform-led regional governance proposals, such as the DSA platform-led governance proposal, such as the Matters Oversight Board. We have national frameworks, as the Online Safety Act, and also liability-focused regime from the industrial associations, such as the Manila Principles and Santa Clara Principles. So all of this could be roughly put into the rules and norms that's currently governing the online space and what people can say and cannot say. You have platform rules, you have national laws and regulations, and underlying that, you have international human rights frameworks and some non-binding guiding principles. And then they communicate with each other, they inform each other. Each political actors in the network also acts on their own respective normative foundations while responding to the others. An example could be that platforms' internal content rules are informed by and committed to international human rights frameworks, but they're not legally bound by those frameworks. But instead, they're increasingly held liable by national laws and regulations that local states have developed, partly because, as some of the colleagues in the audience have addressed, that inadequate regulations of platforms may also indicate the state's failures to fulfill their positive obligations to protect human rights. Although states have ratified these treaties, their interpretation of these universal values also vary. And then beyond the rules, you have the informal norms and values that constitute what we call morality and decency. So this is pretty much what brings me to the theory framework of legitimacy, and which has guided me through all my empirical analysis. why do we need a theory like this? So legitimacy refers to the belief that the system of norms, rules, and actions are acceptable and appropriate. So essentially, we're just seeing the system of norms and rules and actions. And also, at the same time, legitimation refers to the process of achieving so. So by the definitions, you can tell that it not only includes a consensual framework on a normative base, that is normative legitimacy. There's also, even if there's no normative consensus of what is prohibited, what is appropriate, you can still achieve a certain level of pragmatic legitimacy if the actions are justified. So pretty much my analysis of the legitimacy of platformized speech governance are from these two perspectives. That is the normative criteria and pragmatic considerations guiding each actor's practices. So it's also very important to acknowledge that I'm pretty much inspired by a lot of socio-legal literature, such as Julia Black, who's talking about legitimacy in a polycentric governance regimes. Because transnational speech governance, like most global platforms, operate across national borders. So it involves multiple actors, rules and norms, and sources of authority. It is that crucial to understand legitimacy through the interactions and communicative structures among different social actors, and to regard legitimacy as an ongoing social processes. So my question, again, the overarching question for the entire thesis and line of research is, how are the rules and norms that enable or constrain online speech legitimized, and by whom? Brief introduction and rationale of case selection. So I'm really interested and fascinated by the case of TikTok because I think it's a unique platform compared with the other Silicon Valley born out platform and how it navigates the global digital space. It's unique in a technical design sense, in how it has different visibility dynamics and how it's a mainly multi-model based content platforms. And used during the past year and just earlier this month, it could be considered a Chinese platform in many sense, which makes it both distinctive and informative. So on one hand, TikTok strategies in responding to regulatory scrutiny shows how it could be different compared to its Western counterparts. But on the other hand, as the platform tries to decouple from China, the controversies it's facing shed lights on basically the trends in digital governance that all of the global platforms are facing. So it could be a informative and distinctive case study in this case. In the region of South and Southeastern Asia. So this is the snapshot of the top 10 countries with the largest TikTok audience as of July 2024. And last year when I was writing my first paper, Indonesia was still the second largest market of TikTok, but this year it has become the largest basically global market of TikTok. So out of the top 10, 6 of them are from the region of South and Southeastern Asia. It's a huge market. It's the first go-to place for most Chinese internet platforms, not just social media platforms. Same applies to gaming and e-commerce. But also the huge market potential clashes with delicate speech norms. I just had 2 photos trying to illustrating this is what I took during the field visit in Islamabad earlier this year. Well, in the local market, you have the very sort of old-fashioned television repair shop and the 4G, all the 4G mobile phone retailers operating side by side. It's just showing you how in these countries, people are leaping from the broadcasting era to a mobile phone era without sort of just skipping the PC era. So basically everyone can have a mobile phone. And this is a very sound infrastructure for all those social media platforms because of the relatively sound mobile penetration rate. Here comes my mega slide in terms of what I mean by a mixed methods case study approach. So essentially, my research questions are formulated around the theory of legitimacy. And I start with, and under that, I decide to dig deeper into two specific country cases and have different levels of unit of analysis. So that could be one platform, one country, or different stakeholder groups. So for me, I'm starting from the most prominent platform state relationships in the first step and trying to draw on content analysis of the platform rules, the state's rules, and different media reports to see what's the controversial interactions between platforms and local states in South and Southeastern Asia. And that's the first research question. The second step, I'm bringing in civil society organizations and many more others into this platform governance triangle governance network. And for that, I draw on expert interviews in Indonesia and Pakistan and complemented that with my analysis of secondary documents from both public and internal sources that my interviewees kindly offered. And the question here is essentially, how is legitimacy constructed and communicated among these different political actors, and what normative criteria and pragmatic considerations are shaping their moderation decisions. Moving beyond the state platform CSO triangle, I'm also fascinated by how users within those governance network perceive these interactions. How does that all be perceived or misperceived? So the question I'm asking is, under what circumstances do users in Indonesia and Pakistan perceive content moderation of specific borderline content as more legitimate? So this is about an empirical analysis of their legitimacy belief for those who are on those social media platforms. And then I'm also including some open-ended responses in this survey experiment. And the idea is to see what are the other normative concerns among this user group? How do they think? How do they reason when they make those judgments in this survey experiment? So pretty much these are the data sources I'm having at hand for this large project that includes secondary document analysis, expert interviews, survey experiment with users, and a thematic analysis of open-ended responses. For sure, there are many other well-known data sources that people can draw on, but this is what I'm having at hand. So following the case study approach, I formulate the questions, I define the case and the unit of analysis, and I then design the case and crosswalk of data sources and my different analytical approach. And what's more important for a case study approach is that in the end, I want to answer the question of how do the stakes of platform governance and legitimacy remain or differ within the context of Indonesia and Pakistan, but also beyond and compare with other regional, global platforms and country contexts. So I want it to be comparable, similar, but also like comparably different to each other. And also informative to our analysis of platformized speech governance on a global scale. So I'm going to give in a reasonable detail some results and methodological details of what I do for this different step of the case analysis. And then this is the paper I presented at the AIR conference. So I'm gonna quickly skim through the results. Basically, this serves as a scoping, context setting purpose of this analysis. The ultimate goal of this paper is to understand how does the platform structure this capacity in the region of South and Southeastern Asia, and what are the moderation controversies this platform's, aka TikTok, has faced in the region of South and Southeastern Asia. I want to understand what are the existing rules that's on the ground. So to do this, as I mentioned earlier, draw on some well-established records from the platforms. I have platforms' own rules and enforcement data. I have regulations and government policies from the 5 countries of interest. But beyond that, because the normative documents don't offer you too much detail and granular moderation policies, and is hugely consistent across platforms. So one case in point is if you look into Google's transparency report, it discloses whether or not there which specific branches is it judiciary, is it legislative, is it executive that they are receiving governmental requests from, but you can't really find those details from TikTok's transparency reporting structure. So given the limitations of the normative documents from the platform side and the government side, I'm trying to look into what are the controversies through media reports. So here, the idea is looking into power dynamics and then think of power dynamics come to the forefront through controversy, and that are the notable incident that challenges the platform's core principles and promoting operational adaptations, essentially. There have been a lot of literature in STS studies about why controversy mapping or issue mapping is essential for you to identify who are the key stakeholders and observe the dynamics among the local stakeholders. So in doing so, I basically constructed a news corpus based on the Factiva news database, and I search using the keyword TikTok, TikToker, many variations of that during the time period from 2017 September to 2023 September. And then the search was later refined to include media outlets from the 5 countries I'm interested in, and specifically with reports covering those 5 countries. So I'm having a designated search query in the news database. And then I extracted a subset from them using keywords containing ban government regulations. That would give me about 600 news reports. And for each identified controversy cases, which could include a sequence of news reports, and coding them or conduct a content analysis about the time of the controversy, the content areas, who are the stakeholders involved, what's the regulating approach, and if there are any responses from the platform. So essentially, this is a snapshot of the top 10 media sources that I'm having based on the original query and the keywords I'm using. There is a very huge limitation in this approach that I think I need to acknowledge at this stage, is that because of the keywords I'm using, those results I'm getting, it's primarily reliant on English media, and which could introduce representation compared with local language reporting, or some English editions of the local media outlets. So to mitigate the potential framing issues, I'm not trying to use the media coverage and trying to calculate how prominent certain issues are, but rather just to use this as a data sources to cross-validate and check what are the content subject to regulations and what are the stakeholders involved. So in this case, I'm not trying to claim that this is a representative sample of news reports, but rather to say these are some existing data sources I can draw at hand to look into what are the controversial content areas and stakeholders involved. But this is a huge limitation, and I feel like I could have done better by using translations or many others in doing this controversy mapping. So essentially, the analysis of the local legislations gave me a table like this. So I'm having what's the relevant legislations for corresponding country and what are the specific speech restrictions coded in the law in specific articles. But what's more relevant is the results of the controversy mapping I did. So based on the analysis of the lines of news reports, I summarized them. This is more like a reasonable summary of the specific controversial content areas and the regulating approach from each countries, and the main actors and the moderation compliance. And based on this table, this gives me a more detailed understanding of the variations within this region, how different regulators in each countries are approaching the platforms. And that's what leads me to choose 2 very prominent cases, Pakistan and Indonesia. Pakistan is more like a regarding platforms as the governor of speech and reoccurringly ban certain platforms through DNS blocking. But the power is largely overseen and balanced by the judiciary system in Pakistan. And in the Indonesian case, is more cooperative research where the regulations predominantly targeting individual content and posters. and there is a very relatively high level of civil society engagement. So this is a slide basically illustrating the similarities and differences across the two country cases I'm studying. They both have huge market potential for TikTok and all other social media platforms, but also have very high content removal rates during the past 5 to 6 years in question. But the religious context and the political system play out quite differently or slightly differently across these two countries. Although Indonesia and Pakistan have the world's largest and second largest Muslim population, the religious sensitivity manifests in a different way across the two country contexts. And that's what makes them comparable within themselves, but also informative as a case study. So the second step after the scoping analysis I'm doing is to have a mega table of all the institutional actors I can think in mind for me to reach out to and interview. This is a very nice practice or even thought experiment for any of you who are trying to approach a certain country. And this table is pretty much inspired by Robert Gowa's platform governance stakeholders paper, and then I'm basically categorizing them into public sector authorities, civil society actors, and private actors, and then trying to structure them into the regional level and the national level, and then look beyond the platform and state and to see if there's any third-party vendors, legacy firms such as media associations or fact-checking partners in these countries who are private actors collaborating with platforms, but not directly binded by the rules that this private platforms set for themselves. So this guided me in my later on interview stage a lot. And this is more like an iterative process because basically at the start of my in-depth interview, I will always ask people, can you tell me who are the actors you think are most important in this space? What are the relevant legislations? What are the controversial content areas? And then once I think the results reaches a reasonably saturated point that the table itself is pretty much representing who are the key stakeholders on the ground, I shift the focus of my research questions into the how question, the why question, the process question. So the research outline itself is also based in a predefined theoretical perspectives in the sense that I would ask people both in practice, what do you think? How do you communicate with each other? And on the normative level, how do you think open communication on the internet could be legitimately limited? So this is pretty much a high-level illustration of what I'm having at the moment based on this in-depth interviews. So I categorized 3 actor groups, and I'm trying to use the interviews to understand what are their respective legitimacy claims and how do they communicate with each other, what are the relative power dynamics. So you have the platforms, aka TikTok, on the ground who's trying to navigate the trust deficit, and then they have a proven record to be more willing to align with local authorities than any other social media platforms. And in the state level, basically you've seen or you will be observing a relatively high level of regulatory anxiety underlying its or justifying its defensive approaches. And for the civil society organizations, you would see how they are pushing for change through a strategic activism. So I'm very happy to deeper into the details of the interviews, and I'm trying to split the 2 case studies into 2 separate chapters and then write on them and have like a similar diagram illustrating the power dynamics for each country. But this is also, I think, would be a helpful practices. And the thickness here of this arrows represents what I am thinking from a researcher perspective, the relative power strengths of each actor in country cases. And then a bit of the survey experiment that I'm running for social media users. As we have mentioned before, the question here is trying to understand how users perceive those moderation systems and trying to see what are the factors influencing their legitimacy perceptions. So the design of this survey experiment is very much informed by the qualitative work done before, both from the expert interviews and analysis of the secondary document. So the first factors I'm thinking is who are making the decisions of the certain moderation decisions. So in the survey experiment, I'm telling the participant that a certain borderline post is flagged by either local governments, the algorithmic systems, a group of human moderators, or trust partners, and that is the civil society organizations in the local countries. And the second factor is how the decisions are made. So group participants are randomly assigned to one of the 16 conditions, and with one group of participants, they will be given opportunities to contest the decisions if they disagree with it. The others would not be given this opportunity. So this is a procedural contestability and how I operationalize them. And the third factor is what outcomes the decision achieves. So for that, I'm measuring how users think about different borderline content first, and then give them either aligned or misaligned outcome with their pre-existing view on this moderation. And I want to understand how the three factors individually and jointly influence people's perceived legitimacy. And the way I'm measuring perceived legitimacy is basically through the 6 items or aspects, very much draw on organizational justice literature and procedural fairness literature. So the first is empowerment of authority. The second is whether or not they trust this moderation system. The third is, do they think the process of making the decisions are fair? And the fourth is, do they think the outcome is just and deserved? The fifth is, even if they disagree with the decision, would users still think they would accept these decisions? And the last would be, overall speaking, how legitimate they think this moderation process is. And of course, I'm controlling variables such as social media use, their free speech attitudes, and their support for free speech under certain moral restrictions and their social demographics. A very high level finding so far is that across the two countries, the outcome alignment plays a major role in influencing how users perceive the legitimacy of the moderation. So the procedure contestability and who make the decisions are less important compared with who users think, how users think certain content should be handled by social media platforms. So this is a pre-register survey experiment, and I'm very much to also talk about the details of the design later in the Q&A. Some final words and reflections on all of the studies, the line of research I've done so far. The first is, I think it's very important to choose the right cases, or even the right number of cases that you want to use in your mixed method nested design. And it's very important how you can translate some of the quantitative data, or I would say the case study setting is nice in a sense that you can translate some of the quantitative data, such as survey, into the narratives that fits into the entire story. And you can also use the qualitative findings as groundwork to inform the design of the survey experiment instead of just making an experiment from scratch. The second is, I am not speaking the local languages in Indonesia and Pakistan, which is a huge language barrier in analyzing the data sources I'm having and in talking to the experts and the content creators on the ground. I have some piloting interviews during my fieldwork in Islamabad and Jakarta, but it's very, very difficult for me to truly understand what people are expressing. But beyond the language barrier, I figure that there are more challenges that's like more hard to solve than the language itself. And that is the perspectives of trying to understand countries that's understudied and less fitting into the sort of liberal democratic legitimacy narratives. So a case study needs to be grounded in theory, but it also needs to go beyond the specific case context to think how it can inform the theory. So in my case, I'm there are pretty much like the existing literature pretty much are talking about legitimacy and legitimation in the sense that whether or not it aligns with rule of law, whether or not it's a democratic participation, those are the important principles and values for assessing whether or not certain governance proposals are legitimate. But I also figured these are not the ultimate goal of my research. So I'm not trying to come up with a unitary framework of assessing if the governance proposals in Indonesia and Pakistan are legitimate in a ABC sense, but which risks normalizing the regimes of oppression and the expressions of the power inequalities. But for my research, I'm trying to understand how legitimacy is negotiated, contested, and communicated among the different actors who are all actively engaged in the governance of the digital public sphere. So I do feel like there are some fundamental questions from this case study that could inform political and cultural theory, which could include how do we understand legitimate interests, given that people have different perceptions of what is appropriate and acceptable, and people have different moral standards, and those moral standards and normative judgments do change over time, and they all impact people's considerations of what is acceptable online, and also the challenges of balancing what is free expression for certain individuals while it could mean harm or offense to a collective values in a certain countries, and the potential consequences of suppressing minority views in a majority rule context. So with that, I'll pause here because I feel I'm rambling enough, and I welcome any questions or comments and suggestions on the method and results of the study. Thank you.